Ready to start one out?
Oh, sure. Sorry to keep people waiting. I was on a call, but welcome everybody. My name is Jeremy, he, him. I'm the co-chair of NYC-DSA, freshly back from Chicago, the National DSA Convention. So forgive me if my brain only partially works. I, at one point was, had gone to the pool and getting a slice of Chicago pizza delivered and wandered out in a towel, and several people at convention thought I had lost my mind. And I was like, at convention, if one thing could do it, it's the national convention. But happy to be back and happy to welcome everybody to the third session of this seminar on the labor question. In the past couple of weeks, we had a kind of, we started with like a synoptic history of the United States from pre-colonial to the abolition of slavery and Reconstruction, and kind of the role of the labor question. Last week, the class was on or 2 weeks ago, we meet every 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, the class was on the Gilded Age and the beginning of really industrial labor unions as we know them, and the kind of contestation over the labor question in the late 19th century. And this week we moved to, as I think Stephen called it in the title session, the golden age of labor, and especially maybe focused around early 20th century to the year 1919. So it's my pleasure to hand it off to our professor for the class. We're here to say also, like, norms for political education. We please encourage discussion and participation. Stephen usually begins by giving a short lecture. Then we'll have plenty of time for discussion, Q&A. Obviously, you can ask direct questions to him, or you can just talk to the group. And we'll try to kind of keep ourselves somewhat both open and also kind of focused on trying to understand this period in American labor history. What's, what we can understand about our present in light of it, what things may still apply, what things might be quite different, and think together about the labor question in American society. So without further ado, Steve.
Do you want to do introductions, or should we just skip that?
It's up to you.
I don't care. I mean, it's up to you.
Should we go around and do a quick set of introductions?
Yes, okay. So I'm Steve Fraser, he, him. I'm lead the discussion and labor historian and political activist most of my life.
I'm Sid Carlson White, he, him. I'm St. Paul, Minnesota.
I'm Steve. I'm on the NYC Polyed citywide committee. That's a lot of words. It's a long day. Yeah, happy to be here.
Mike, he, him, active in DSA's labor branch.
Hey, Jesse, he, him, also on the political education committee, and I'll be awkwardly monitoring Zoom during the session. Over here, that's why.
Hi, Stephen Mornell, he, him. Hi.
Hi, Alex Steffel, he, him, member of SAG after.
I'm Eric, pronounce they them, and I'm on the organizing committee in the Brooklyn branch. So if you happen to be an MDK, I connection to the branch chat, say hi after.
Hi, Kathleen Schiffer. I've been to the last two sessions and on Zoom.
Guys, my name is Will, he, him, and Billy, DSA, also is on Zoom. Couldn't hear much. So. Now.
Hey everyone, Aaron, he, him, I live in Brooklyn, and I'm a software engineer.
Oh yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Ethan. I'm relatively new to DSA, so just here to learn.
I'm Ben. I'm on the committee, and these are killer readings. So I'm really excited for the discussion.
Right.
I'm Rima, she, her, and I'm from Central Brooklyn.
Derek, he, him. Not a huge contributor to the DSA, not part of any committee or anything, but might come to these things once in a while. Matt, he, him, in the DSA. Start listening and learning.
I'm Annie, she, her, in Central Brooklyn, and I'm from the political education committee.
I mentioned I'm Jeremy, I live in North Brooklyn. The one thing, as two of our participants mentioned, so we do have some people on Zoom. The insouciance of youth. We're meeting about the youth of the labor movement today. So we do have some people on Zoom. We were hoping actually maybe to have a better microphone today. We don't. So just as an FYI, obviously the main thing is that we're talking to each other. We're here in the room, but the microphone is like there. So just as an awareness of how you project, if you can project your voice a little bit to make sure that people on Zoom can hear, it just aids in their discovery. Though I kind of wonder whether, you know, maybe our secret strategy should be to keep it muted so people come in person, but so yeah, welcome everybody. We just did quick intros if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Millie from Harlem.
All right, thank you everybody for showing up, and I'm glad these little people decided to find out what actually is going on in the room. I know the audio was bad. Jeremy made a good suggestion to me after the class a couple of weeks ago, which I should have thought of myself. So I want to begin this with, why don't you summarize, say, the key points of that session, meaning the last session. So I do that, and we do it now very briefly, and hopefully that will help establish a certain continuity between what we did and what we're going to do today. So these are the highlights. And I'll try to be very compressed about them. First of all, we talked about the populist movement and the dawning of the modern labor question. And those two movements coexisted during the Gilded Age. The link between populism and the movement for against debt, finance, the movement to hold on to petty property, which is what motivated the populist movement. The link between that and what we think of as the modern labor question, that is the labor question that arises in the wage-labor relationship in industrial life, that link is something everybody then called productive labor. There was this kind of exaltation about the laboring person, whether that person labored on his or her own, well, forget her, his own property, and I'll get to the her thing in a moment, or labored as a craftsman or labored in an industrial workshop. The world was made up of a vast universe of productive workers and parasites. That's the great social division, which links populism and people who are working in the way we are accustomed to think of people working in factories and other kind of wage labor situations. And so what we're talking about, and that's why that moment is a moment of transition from one kind of labor and labor emancipation to a concern with a different kind of labor and labor emancipation. And it moves from the realm of circulation, capitalist circulation, debt, mortgages, credit, the need for cheap money to abolish, to get rid of debts, to stay afloat, to survive as a property owner, to the realm of production, that is to where actual exploitation directly is taking place at the workplace. That's one point. That movement, which was somewhat ambivalent and ambiguous, which creates alliances, but also has divisions between industrial work and the petty producer on the farm or the craftsman, is a movement which is not socialist in Maine. There are socialists, but the movement as a whole is talking about the cooperative commonwealth, is very invested in the notion of cooperative production, cooperative distribution. Part of the movement is fueled indeed by the establishment of cooperative enterprises of various kinds, owned cooperatively in order to preserve the survival of the petty producer so that you can market, distribute, store your product cooperatively and survive as an individual producer. And the cooperative commonwealth even looks beyond that to a society which is cooperative and not competitive. But it's not quite socialist, but it is also not Jeffersonian. It is not a throwback to the world that Jefferson envisioned, the empire for liberty, which was a world of household producers in this vast vastness which he had acquired and seized from indigenous populations and from the French and so on. It's not that world. This is a world which is totally implicated in the market. These are petty producers who are producing for the market, but in order to sustain a way of life as independent proprietors. So it's neither socialist nor a world of Jeffersonian simplicity. This politics, which arises as a resistance to the process, is the third point of primitive accumulation. That is to say, what's happening is that the capitalist marketplace, whether we're talking about and the capitalist institutions, banks, insurance companies, grain elevator operators, railroads, all of whom are proliferating throughout the countryside and entangling petty producers in various forms of dependency. That's a kind of primitive accumulation, meaning capital is being accumulated by wiping out a non-capitalist form of production. These petty producers are not employing wage labor, except maybe occasionally, very temporarily, they may employ them, but their basic way of life is not that. And they're facing extinction. And that's what primitive accumulation is, a kind of non-capitalist societies, whether they're indigenous people living in the New World for 10,000 years and own their land, their animals are being absorbed into the capitalist marketplace, or in this case, petty producers who are facing extinction as petty producers. That movement resists that process. It is a movement for emancipation, but also is premised on domination, on at least several forms of domination. One, this is a patriarchal form of production. These are households led by men. The property is owned by men. It is passed down through the male line. Women are considered adjuncts to that process, as are children in the family. So it is, even though it is a movement for freedom, and it is a movement for freedom, it is at the same time a movement premised on a certain kind of domination. It is also a movement to distinguish it from socialism that is very invested in what philosophers and political science have called famously possessive individualism. That is to say, it's very invested in the notion of freedom being freedom of the individual based on possession, self-possession, and possession of property. It's obviously all of settler society, which gives rise to these petty producers, was of course premised on seizing land that had belonged to other people. I mean, manifest destiny, that's what manifest destiny means. It means reducing to subordination or almost extinction various populations, whether they're Mexicans or Native Americans or so on. This produces, as I mentioned last week, a kind of existential crisis. That's why the period is so furious, so full of rage and outrage. That's why the tensions are so high, because it's a threat of extinction, and where property is still seen as good. We get to Emma Goldman, she's going to say property is the enemy. But here we're talking about property under the right circumstances is a source of freedom and virtue. Slavery is two more points. Slavery is the boundary condition of the new world that we're leading into. Slavery, the war against slavery, the successful war against slavery, elevates free wage labor to a position that gives it enormous social and psychological momentum. Freedom is defined as the absence of slavery. That is not, slavery is a word commonly used throughout the Western world at this time, all throughout Western Europe, the 1848 revolutions, which happened all over Europe, all talk about slavery. But it's not wage labor we're talking about. Free labor, which was the way the Civil War was fought, is an attempt to establish wage labor as the acme of freedom. And it's important we understand that, because socialism, the modern labor question, is going to call that into question. It's going to say, wait a second, this is a new form of dependency. But we're always in this American society have to wrestle against the cultural momentum of thinking, wait a second, isn't this freedom? We are no longer enslaved. We can work for this person or not. We can come and go and so on. And finally, what this period involved was an assault on democracy. And we talked a lot about this last time. The rule, this is about the immaturity of a new capitalism, which does not have an array of institutions through which to mediate its rule and resorts again and again to the blunt instrument to enforce its will. We talked about this elite which is not prepared to rule, which is fearful of its own social pedigree, which it doesn't have. It invents them. It relies on will rely on what's called it will attack the suffrage. It will try to limit the suffrage. Democracy, we're going to talk a lot about democracy. Democracy is important in this sense. Democracy, political democracy, can be grudgingly accepted by ruling empowered elites unless that political democracy begins to inch in the direction of something called social democracy. I don't mean, social democracy. The political question becomes a social question. And that's what's feared in the late 19th century, that the struggle for democracy and equality is so bound up with labor uprisings, with enormous mass strikes. And by the way, the form, it's important to understand this, the form that link of productive labor takes between populism and the labor question is the mass strike. That's its medium. The mass strike, which brings everybody together. Farmers, storekeepers, not just this, it happened again and again, not just in the 1877 railroad strike. The mass strike, which spreads its tentacles all throughout society. Anyway, that event strikes fear in the heart of ruling circles and causes them, Morgan, for example, and others, to make movements to limit the suffrage and so on. So that democracy is always a hard one thing. It may be granted by elites, but then they draw back from that. It's always a tendency. Marx said something like this. I actually wrote it in that book, but roughly like this: that the working class, using that term rather loosely, always wants to move on from political to social, the social question. The ruling class always wants to move back away from the social question and even away from political democracy if that democracy seems to threaten the social basis of its power. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go on that long. That was last week. Now, I'll stop. You want to, because I know some of you here, so you want to ask any questions, then I'll get to it. Any questions, comments, or anything? Yeah.
Could you, I wasn't here, I mean, I read last week, but I wasn't here, but could you talk a little bit more about specifically what you see as the difference between social and political in that sense?
Yeah. Well, the political question says, are we all going to have the same rights in the political arena? Is everybody entitled to vote, to participate in the political process, and so on? It leaves out of its concerns what happens outside the political arena. If people are profoundly unequal and without rights, say in the industrial workplace, that's not a concern of political equality, of the political system. It puts a parenthesis around that whole, what sometimes is called civil society. Its call for political democracy only applies to those rights that happen in the political arena and to certain basic civil rights, but not to rights. It doesn't acknowledge that there are rights because there is a right. The right is this: it's free labor. That's the right. You have a right to enter into freely a contractual relationship with the boss. That's your freedom. So that's taken care of. That's the assumption. It's already equal. That's equal. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah. Yes.
you want to say anything about the attempt to bring it to the South and Reconstruction?
Yeah, I did a little bit last week, and what I said last week was that not enough. In a way, the South is excluded from this Gilded Age society because it remains a kind of colonial appendage of the North. Northern investors run rail and manufacturers run railroads down there in order to extract raw materials. Cotton production continues. They connive at the restoration of the old planter mercantile aristocracy after initially supporting, Reconstruction, political empowerment of ex-slaves, even their, but this they draw back from very early on, even their social empowerment, 40 acres of mule, that doesn't last for a nanosecond. But the point I made last week is that that's the two things. That's the hidden racial dimension that's not talked about, because it's not that you're hiding it. It doesn't exist because the South is outside that, and the attempt in the South to unite Black and white smallholders, petty producers, is one of the great terrifying things that happens to the Southern ruling class. We had that quote last week from Tom Watson. Most of you know, was a Georgia senator and someone who was vice presidential candidate with William Jennings Bryan in 1896, came out of the populist movement, calling for a Black-White alliance. And there are farmer alliances. There's the Southern Farmer Alliance, and there's the colored Southern Farmer Alliance. And they begin to build alliances. That's terrifying to the old Bourbon, what's called the Bourbon aristocracy in the South. They managed to overturn Reconstruction. That specter, and that's of course the great, connive that tragedy of the labor question, not only in the South but elsewhere as well. Okay, what else? I'm happy that. Yes.
You said that possession of property is a better thing when it's not in a capitalist system. How is the possession changed based on our economy?
I'm sure I'm following. Say again.
So you said that private property is more acceptable if we're not capitalists.
I'm sorry, private property was.
Is more acceptable if we're not capitalists. No?
Yes, yeah, no, I get it, absolutely, yes. In other words, not only more acceptable, seen as the royal road to freedom. That is to say, you could be, proletarianization is feared, dreaded, because you will descend into a kind of dependency. The way not to descend into that kind of dependency is to own your own property, be able to support yourself. You have to engage, by the time we're talking about the Gilded Age, in the market in order to do that. They are producing cash crops. This is no longer, 1800, where self-sufficient farmers were basically, they're engaged in a little bit of exchange, but basically they're supporting themselves. You have to be in the market, but your purpose in being in the market is to reproduce your life as an independent and pass it on to your heirs, that independence, which gives you even political independence, because no one can push you around, right? You have the wherewithal to sustain yourself. All of this is threatened by the marketplace, by banks and need lines of credit. Commodity speculators are somersaulting the price of the basic goods you're producing. Railroads are charging you exorbitant rates to ship your goods to the market. So all of that is in jeopardy.
I think you're saying that's how it was seen at the time, not like objectively that property is better. Yeah. Yeah,
and it goes back, for some of you who may have been here in the first section, to, not that he was a great social visionary, but John Smith, Captain John Smith, the military leader of Jamestown, nonetheless an explorer and promoter. He was a promoter. He was a venture capitalist in a way, a military guy. Envisions the new world as a place where every man may be his own master. And that's the revolutionary concept at that time, when labor is despised and thought of as inferior and lowly. And so this is out of control.
I know, I'm really hesitant.
It's my fault. It's my fault. His fault, because he said I should do it.
Maybe let's say this is the last one. move to.
Okay, that's it.
I guess I'm wondering if like, because it seems like the Knights of Labor kind of fit a little bit outside of that sort of
Yeah.
Perspective on property.
Yeah.
So they kind of represent the shift from
Yes,
this age of populism into this age of
Right.
the golden age of the labor question.
right.
Okay.
Yes, that's right. And that's what I meant, that's this link between the Knights of Labor also extol productive labor and see the American society as a world of productive laborers like them and parasites. And look, that goes today. We still use that language, not quite in that kind of universal social way that they did, but we still think that way sometimes. And sometimes that is opportunistic, rhetorical. This is the point. We'll get to that later. Okay, so I now want to do, and you here, when I start now, cut me off at any time, so I don't, really, I mean it. So I want to talk about, as I do, as I tend to do, I want to establish the framework for the stuff you read. And I'm very glad to hear that you all read it, because I'm joking. I hope I'm not joking, because the last part of this, I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions about what you read, so see if it generates some discussion. But here's the framework. That world is the framework for the modern labor question and its golden era is that world we just talked about in severe crisis. First of all, economic crisis. The economic crisis, and now you can start looking at your quotes. Look at the, I assume you all got them or passed out, or maybe they weren't. Don't look at your quotes. Right?
So they're in the folder online. We didn't.
All right, hold it.
They're like directed email.
Yeah.
The point is this economy, this new capitalist economy, is a laissez-faire capitalist economy, is producing constant crises, panics, depressions, wild speculative escapades. Every 20 years, there's a huge depression in 1873, which lasted 4 years, very severe. There's another one in the mid-80s. There's one in 1893, which lasts for 4 years and helps to account for populism and its strength. Populism rises to its greatest power during that period of severe. So this is an economy constantly going bust. It's hyper competitive. It's a kind of internecine competition. It's the market devouring itself. And for that reason, it presents a crisis even to capitalists. Forget about workers who are suffering the depression, the unemployment, and so on. In 1893, and 4 and 5, people are literally starving in the streets of Chicago. That's how bad the depression is. But it's capitalists as well. And had you had these folks, you will see the first bunch of folks. Can I read them? I got it right here. So Morgan, J.P. Morgan is kind of for capital in this period of crisis, the hero. Nobody is as great a heroic figure as he is, because he civilizes, controls, and administers and stops, he tries to stop, the internecine competition, which is producing these panics, depressions, and so on, and producing the uproar that right. So here's a quote. This is from Harper's Weekly on the occasion of Morgan's death in 1913. J.P. Morgan was a matchless upbuilder of properties, a faithful trustee of buildings, full of faith in his country and his fellow man, a Christian, staunch, devoted, and untiring in fidelity to Christianity, above all, a true patriot, a lover of power, but not of money. That's Harper's Weekly. The Reverend who presided at his funeral, who died in London, funeral at Trinity Church, which is buried in New York, in 1913. J.P. Morgan will rank in the history of this republic as one of the greatest men God has yet raised to serve it. Then there's a friend of Walt Whitman's, a poet and essayist, a guy named Harold Travel, says this: what the power, but he's not saying, well, it's not a question of liking, but how powerful. What the power of wealth stood for, he, Morgan, was that. He was stocks, bonds, banks, railroads, trusts, financiering, chicanery, profit. He was the shadow of his time. We put his age away in the hole in the ground with him. And then finally, I don't know if you ever read the novel, Mark Twain's Pudd'nhead Wilson. I love this line. This, but no, I'm quoting this to give you a sense of the upheaval, the constant uncertainty, anxiety this economy produces. Puddinhead says this, October. This is one of the peculiarly dangerous months to speculate in stocks in. The others are July, January, September, April, November, May, March, June, December, August, and February. So, in other words, he's right. This is an economy which is racked by uncertainty and high risk, and people are suffering. Morgan's way of dealing with, and it's not just Morgan. Capitalist enterprises are trying to control the situation. They form trusts to stop individual firms from competing against each other. They form what are called pools to divide up the market. Railroads form pools. So railroads are so out of control that they will build parallel lines to the same place. They're issuing bonds to build these lines, and then the lines go bankrupt, the bonds go bankrupt, and you have a panic. Morgan, because the capital is finally being congealed with some of the key banking, and not just his, some of the key banking institutions in the country, and it can exercise a discipline. The market needs discipline, and in order to stop this kind of chaos. And Morgan, because of the powerful position he's in, does that. He begins to place his partners, and other banks do the same, on the boards of directors of some of the key railroads. He amalgamates these railroads in some cases. He stops them from the kind of competitive, irrational competition they were involved in. The same kind of pooling arrangements happen in various sectors of the economy. There's an effort, in other words, afoot to do it privately control this out of control marketplace. And Morgan is the great genius. And there's a verb, he Morganizes the economy. And people talk about that. And that's why he's being extolled in those, because he seems to have brought some modicum of peace and stability to the marketplace. But besides this economic crisis, as you might suspect, there is also a political crisis, a crisis of laissez-faire as a way of conducting your political affairs. Up until now, what you have every effort, there are many efforts at the state level, often fueled by the anti-monopoly movement, the populist movement, the Knights of Labor during the Gilded Age, to regulate the market. Regulate it how? Passing minimum wage laws, maximum hour laws, ending child labor, regulating the railroads. States pass these laws because locally, these movements have the legislative, the political power to do that. They do, and they pass railroad. So they regulate the railroads. They regulate the rates that granaries can charge for storing a farmer's grain. All of these laws are passed. They pass laws regulating the number of hours bakers can work in a bakery. It used to be 14 or 16, and they passed laws to do that. They even regulate child labor and women's labor, and so on and so forth. And there's such enormous pressure to bring some kind of stability that there's passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is an attempt to stabilize the marketplace. But what happens? All of these laws, without exception, are declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Every single one. So this laissez-faire system won't allow itself to produce a kind of stable marketplace. And even the child labor law, which was passed in 1916 in a nanosecond, that's a federal law, not a state law, is declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court 2 years later. So this is a question. Instead, what we have are the Sherman Act. The Sherman Act is passed and mainly is used, as you probably know, he's nodding at the
Labor unions.
Right, it's used against strikes. And to crush strikes. Strikes are considered conspiracies in restraint of trade, which is what the Sherman Act is supposed to stop from happening, but doesn't do that much at all when it comes to corporations who are engaged in such conspiracies all the time, and instead does that. And then they issue injunctions to stop strikes. And these are called Gatling gun injunctions, because what they really mean is if you strike, federal troops or the National Guard or state and local militias will be called out. And so you're abetting this kind of tension in the society and not solving it. Okay, so you have this. So this is the key thing. This is the moment when we think of as modern liberalism is born. Classical liberalism is the system of laissez-faire individualism, no state regulation of the economy. That's what we mean. That's classic liberalism. No interference, government keeping hands off. We hear that rhetoric today, obviously, and that's classic liberalism. Modern liberalism says no. This society is out of control, and this is where we get the birth of attempts to indeed introduce various forms of state regulation. That's why the child labor law even gets to pass, even though the court declares it unconstitutional. You get a Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914 to begin to rein in the trust. You get the Federal Reserve created. There's a lot of reasons the Federal Reserve, but one reason it's created is to bring some stability to the credit and financial system in the country. Get the income tax is passed to begin to do something about the maldistribution of income. This is modern liberalism because certain factions, and they're within, we're going to get to this stuff and talk about what we read. In the major political parties, there are divisions. So if you read some of these quotes, you don't have it. I gotta read you one though. I gotta read you one about the old order. You got it?
Sorry, there was no federal income tax before.
There was no income tax till 1913. Yeah.
A lot of the revenue through the customs.
Say again?
A lot of the revenue came through the customs house.
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely, yeah.
Not that they did much.
Can I just give an anecdote
Yeah.
of the income tax? If you ever visit Newport, Rhode Island, where all the Gilded Age robber barons have their mansions, it's really great because there are these, whatever huge European castles that they're trying to imitate European aristocracy. But you look at the wall text or whatever, and they're like, the Vanderbilts lived here until the income tax passed. Yeah, their family had to give up the mansion. So it was pretty epochal for how much.
Yeah, we take a lot of these, it's a good question, we take these things for granted, but it's modern liberalism, which from its own point of view, and modern liberalism is a varied phenomenon. It includes people like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. It also includes people like Jane Addams and Louis Brandeis, future Supreme Court. In other words, it's a range of people seeing a society out of control. Gotta read you these quotes though, because I'm depriving you of joy. Yes.
Oh, it's just a quick thing, actually. But I guess in school, you kind of learn what comes after the Gilded Age is the progressive era.
Yeah.
That basically what
This is the progressive era, but I'm defining it, and it is the progressive era. It's right. It's the first basically 2 decades of the 20th century until the war puts an end to it. But I'm defining it as because modern liberalism is going to deal with the modern labor question in its own way. I'm going to get to that in a moment. But first, I'm going to do this. Going back just a moment, to give you a sense of the old order of things. The rights and interests of the laboring man will best be protected not by labor agitators, but by the Christian men to whom God, in his infinite wisdom, has given control of the property interests of the country. That's George Baer, who's a mine owner and head of the Mine Owners Association during the quite violent, widespread 1902 anthracite coal mine strike. That's the world that was in charge. This is the new world. Oh, and there's another example of this. Well, I'll give you one more. There's a guy named Mark Hanna. Mark Hanna is a kind of kingmaker in the Republican Party, becomes a senator in Ohio. He's a very, very big deal.
Karl Rove's hero.
Yeah, that's right. Karl Rove of his day. And he's a witty guy. He says there are only 2 things that are important in politics. The first is money, and I can't remember what the second one is. And he's right. He's right. That system he's living in, that's the way it works. Now, can I do one? I need is anybody Irish here? Want to do an Irish accent? There was a great humorist, a guy named Finley Peterson, in the late 19th, early 20th century, very hilarious guy. And he did this, he had a character, okay, I'll read it to them. I'm not anybody an actor here? Yes.
I used to be.
Yeah,
What is strike? You can't do this. You can say that for non-profits.
He said, okay. Yeah. So now this new world that's emerging in both parties. Within the parties, the traditional Democratic Party has already been divided by populism, right? William Jennings Bryan is the candidate of the Democratic Party in 1896 and for many years thereafter, representing a Western agrarian base of the party, not the Eastern banking establishment, which was there before the Civil War. There's a division in the party. It's about currency, about greenbacks, about various other things, about distribution of wealth and so on. In the Republican Party, Roosevelt breaks with the sitting president, William Howard Taft, who would be his successor, and forms a new party called the Bull Moose or Progressive Party, which calls for things like a child labor law, which before he had seen, that doesn't matter, calls for that, for the 8-hour day, for a whole series of reforms, for women's suffrage. Remember, there's also no vote for women at this time. Here's Theodore Roosevelt. I am simply unable to make myself take the attitude of respect for the very wealthy men with such an enormous multitude of people evidently feel, like those people who are writing about Morgan. There's a lot of people who feel that way. I am delighted to show courtesy to Pierpont Morgan or Andrew Carnegie or James J. Hill. But as for regarding them, for instance, as I regard Peary, the Arctic Perry, I guess, the Arctic explorer, or Rhodes, the historian, he had weird choices. Anyway, why I could not force myself to do it, even if I wanted to, which I don't. Okay, here's Louis Brandeis. He was a Supreme Court justice. He's appointed by Woodrow Wilson to the Supreme Court, sits on the court for many, many years, liberal justice. He wrote a book called Other People's Money. We use that phrase, it's part of our lingua franca even to this day. He said this: we must break the money trust, or the money trust will break us. And he's a loyal Democrat, he's a Wilson advisor. Wilson will go to war in his own way against the money trust. The Federal Reserve happens during the Wilson administration. And here's Wilson. The truth is we are all caught in a great economic system, which is heartless. So at the very top levels of these parties, there are divisions about how this society can be governed. We want to do something to regulate it, to administer it, and so on. Here's another famous progressive, you probably heard of, Robert LaFollette from Wisconsin, says this: these men are but hired megaphones through which a beefy, red-faced, thick-necked financial bully, drunk with wealth and power, bawls his orders to stock markets, directors, courts, government, and nations. We have been listening to Mr. Morgan. That's what LaFollette saying that in 1908. But there are other people who are part of this criticism, this critique. Jane Addams, for example, is one. I'm sorry to read these quotes, but they're good quotes. And I work so hard to find them. Okay, here's Jane Addams. The shocking experience of that summer, she's talking about the 1892 Pullman strike, 1894 Pullman strike, the barbaric instinct to kill, roused on both sides. Pay attention to the language here. What's scaring her is this barbaric instinct to kill roused on both sides. It's the divisiveness of this society. Liberalism will look to heal that divisiveness, to deny it, to repress it, to find a way out of it. Right? Socialism will do something very different than that. But these are liberals, and she's obviously a well-meaning reformer and Hull House and so on. And the sharp division into class lines with the resultant distrust and bitterness, that's what she's worried about. Rightly so. But it's not what your readings, they're not worried about that in that way. The social passion of the age is directed toward the emancipation of the wage worker. This is her. That a great accumulation of moral force is overmastering men and making for the emancipation of the slave. And then she says this, and this really captures a different quote: any class or set of men deprived of the companionship of the whole becomes correspondingly decivilized and crippled. Think about it. In other words, she's worried about the barbarism inherent in this laissez-faire, hyper-competitive, class-divided kind of society. She wants it to end. And she's gonna look for ways to do that. And then there's one other, and I mentioned this last week. All great employing corporations will realize that the solution of all the troubles of labor and capital lies in the principle upon which Pullman, means the town of Pullman, is built. That's a magazine that's very popular in the 19th century. In other words, Pullman is a utopian experiment at solving the class struggle by building this model town of harmony, everybody's welfare is taken care of. This is Pullman is no liberal, but this is what liberalism is looking for. Capitalism adapts. Capitalism is never only one thing. It is a moving kind of system. Faced with crises, it will look for ways to adapt. And there are various people who contribute to that, whether they are actually men of great wealth and power, or other people in the middle classes who worry about that social divisiveness. And they will look to conciliate. They'll talk about arbitration. The National Civic Federation is a group of very powerful corporations in America that wants to break with George Baer. They want to meet with labor. They want to meet with labor under controlled circumstances. They want to meet because this George Baer thing is producing these uproars, these mass strikes. So they want a way out of that. Samuel Gompers wants a way out of that. He wants to use the leverage of craft workers to find a fair trade. It's unfair now because labor is too weak, too dependent, at the mercy of employers. But if you unionize, you get a fair deal. And then the system can stabilize, right? You'll stop having these kinds of explosions. So you have that kind of middle road. So what happens is, given this, you get two, now we're with the labor question itself, two roads that a solution to the labor question can take. One is this road of conciliation, trade in this period. Conciliation, arbitration, trade unionism, collective bargaining, and so on. The National Association of Manufacturers will not go along with this. They're adamant. They're George Baer types. They don't buy this. But parts of liberal and bourgeois society do. Or the other solution is the outlaw. It's us. That is to say, okay. Things have reached such an impasse that elements, socialists, wobblies, anarchists, others, leading, in some cases, very important, powerful strikes, take a different attitude. Sidney Hillman, who I won't wrote a book about, who's a socialist from the old country, he helped to found one of the garment unions, says this, listen to the language. One can hear the footsteps of the deliverer. Labor will rule and the world will be free. In other words, we're not conciliating. Labor will rule. That's a different vantage point on how to solve the labor question. Big Bill Hayward, one of the founders of Western Federation of Miners and of course of the IWW. I despise the law and I am not a law-abiding citizen. It is our purpose to overthrow the capitalist system by forcible means if necessary. It's very extreme language, but these are extreme times that these people are living through. So you have these two, and we're going to talk a lot about these two solutions, especially that latter one. And proud of, they're breaking bad, to use maybe bad, but they're prepared to break bad. That is to say, they see bourgeois law. Look, the IWW doesn't hold the contract as a sacred bond. It will engage when it feels it needs to in violations of the contract. It will strike. It will engage in sabotage and so on. It will use a variety of tactics because it is not for fair trade, right? It is not. It's not. It will naturally, organize. When it goes into Lawrence and organizing immigrant women in Lawrence textile mill in Massachusetts, it will win great victories, and it's a better trade. The workers in Lawrence do much better. They get better wages, and the situation improves dramatically. It's not that they will not accept that, but it's not their purpose. the ideal government's purpose. So I want to 2 or 3 more points, then we're going to talk. What you're looking at when you have a crisis like this is a failure of ruling and middle-class elements to culturally reproduce themselves, because the crisis is very severe. So when you have a Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, or a Jane Addams, and all a whole phalanx of social scientists and economists, Richard Ely is one of the chief economists, one of the founders of the American Economic Association in the 19th century. He believes in a kind of Christian economics. He wants to break with the free market, with that theory of how the market should operate. See, they're fed up. Louis Brandeis is prepared, and this happens at moments of great crisis. You read maybe my essay. John Reed comes from he played Poland. I mean, his father was working in Poland. He was born into that world. But that world, and the world that Reed relates to, at Harvard, Massachusetts, even including people he soon gets over it, like Walter Lippmann and others, they can't stomach what they see, and they're looking for ways to do it. So they can be liberal or they can be radical. Radical like Reed, who looks to Bolshevism as the ultimate thing that in the end is the realization of his dreams, or they can be much more moderate, like a Teddy Roosevelt or Wilson. Okay, one other thing, someone asked this last time, I don't know if that person's in the room. War takes on a different, is that you? War takes on a different meaning. There have always been empires, always been, just like there's always been slavery. But this is a different kind of war. It's embedded in the speeches that we read today. This is war. War is reconceived as capitalist war, as war that originates in imperial, by which they mean capitalist competition for markets, investment outlets around the world. The United States has played its role, opening up markets for the open door policy around the world, and China elsewhere as well. And then the competition internally now is externalized around the world, and socialism will become an anti-war movement because it's part of the class struggle. And that was never the case before. There may have been many other reasons for opposing empires and so on, but now, and it's because the class struggle is globalized. And maybe you felt some of that in some of the stuff you read for this week. And where this all leads is what my little essay was about, is this whole outlaw world, which is millions of people. These are these cowboys and prospectors and miners and that Haywood grows up in and wobbles. These are all these, the Emma Goldman world of the barrio, the immigrant working class. This is the world of social banditry, and as well as organized labor. All of them, for different reasons, they're very different kinds of people, are caught up in this global ferment that finds its final, its resolution, everybody thought, in the Bolshevik Revolution. That's why Reed and Haywood and Emma Goldman, whatever their later misgivings, are drawn magnified because it's done it. It's done it. This is what you're talking about. Okay. But of course, there's enormous reaction against that world. I'll read you this. The Red Scare, people dismiss, they say, oh, America is such a relatively social, peaceful society. And they say, well, the Red Scare was just a reign of terror, which he was, against the radicals and the immigrants, and everyone's reported in jail. And that's why Emma has to leave, and Haywood has to leave, and why Reed can't come back because he was going to spend many years in jail if he does come back. I don't think he wanted to come back anyways. The point is that, no, 1919 was an extraordinary year. No year ever in American history, in my opinion, was like that. There are strikes of the most extraordinary kind on every sector of the economy. including, as you probably know, the police of all people go on strike in Boston. There's the Great Steel Strike, the coal strikes, telegraph operators, actors. Broadway goes on strike. Everybody is on strike. There's a general strike that begins the year in Seattle. General strikes are very, very rare. And this is what Hayden's talking about. Get to that in a minute. And Palmer is a reaction to that. And there is a Red Scare, feeling that Bolshevism is here. And in a way, it is here. There's no Communist Party. It was born in the midst of all this. But Bolshevism, in the way that Haywood greets the revolution, Emma, who becomes a severe critic of the Soviet Union very soon, nonetheless, initially sees it as an enormous accomplishment, the emancipation she's been dreaming of, working for her whole life. So let me just read you these things. The reaction. Most of the hordes of immigrants who have been pouring into the United States from countries of Southern and Eastern Europe, from lands inhabited by racists impregnated with radicalism, Bolshevism, anarchy, belong for the most part to the lower strata of humanity. That's a general of the army by the General Wood in 1919. And the racializing of the lower orders has always been a kind of universal, not strictly confined to African American tendency among ruling circles. Here, A. Mitchell Palmer, after whom the Palmer raids are named, he's the Attorney General of the United States, says hysterical, neurasthenic women abound in communism. Revolution right now, looking at the altars of churches, leaping, look at what's at stake here. Looking at the altars of churches, leaping into the belfry of school bells, crawling into the sacred corners of American homes to replace marriage vows with libertine laws. Yeah, that's it. Bolshevism, and it's in America, is the death of bourgeois civilization. That's what it is. It's not just they want more money. They want to end Western civilization as these people have defined it. And then about Haywood and war. He says it was better to be a traitor to your country than a traitor to your class. Okay, I'm going to stop with that. And here's what I'd like to do. In the hope that you guys have read stuff and we can talk about that. I'd like to ask some questions and you guys respond. If that's okay. This is about the readings. First of all, I wanted to start with the film. Did you watch the PBS documentary about Debs? Anybody? No, that's a damn shame. It's not very good, and that's why I wanted you to watch it. You know what it is? I'll tell you. You have to take my word for it. So you want nobody watched it? Okay. I just skip it. Here's the thing: it's an hour. It's very well done, very polished. It's a PBS thing. You know, Danny Glover is the narrator. It's all very well done. It's a sanitized version. Yes. And this is a trend in a lot of radical, in the retelling of radical history, once it's become kosher to do so, it's okay. Not these guys worried about the altar legend, that stuff. This is after that, it's okay. And civil rights is talked about. What's the thing? These radicals, he was an extraordinary person and a kind of saintly guy, no question. But what the film wants you to come away with is the sense that what he really is just a true blue American. That what he's been arguing for is in the American brain. It's democracy and equality. It's the basic things the country was founded on. Well, now that you know that, I'm telling you that. You might watch the film and say, that's a load of crap. That's not what it does. I think it's what it does. And I'll tell you another way it does. Okay. You've read Debs. Does that accord with what you've read about Debs? It's things you've read.
That the country is about.
What Debs is a kind of personification, embodiment of basic American traditions, American democracy, American equality. Is that the brunt of what Deb says can't war speech. And war speech is about what it's 1912 campaign, the vice president. Yeah,
I feel like that's, I mean, like, knowing that he doesn't think those are the American values.
yeah.
I do think he kind of represents those things, but he would disagree with the premise that those are what the America
Okay,
represents.
so you would say that, which is a common thing to say, that those are American values, but America has to live up to them. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not even that they're just that they are, I mean, in word only, that they're not even American values per se, but I do think in terms of those concepts, Debs does, he is advocating for them, but not on the basis that they're American per se.
Other people, yes.
I think like you can make a number of arguments. You could look at sort of the bourgeois or proprietarian nature of dominating US ideologies, or you can kind of take the approach that like the Enlightenment project, like this is the realization of those values under industrial conditions. So it depends on how charitably you want to be the idea of America.
Okay. Others.
I mean, like
Yes.
I read the speech. And like, I feel like there's stuff, there's stuff that almost sounds like generic boilerplate politician speech that's always like, no, I'm going to take on the big guy for the sake of the average American. And like, obviously, I think that his politics actually does that better than a lot of politicians. But it definitely is like a common refrain. I feel like a lot of politicians across.
Okay, here's the things that yes, Jeremy.
Well, I was just gonna say though, I mean, there's just very little mention of, there's very little mention of America. It's mostly a mention of like, I mean, it's very Marxist. And all the speeches, I mean, it's sort of, I mean, Communist Manifesto as translated to conditions in the 1910s.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we talk about American values, American values. Talk about class concept. That's what he really is talking about. He's talking about, America is allergic, American mainstream culture is allergic to the very notion of class. It thinks of America as a non-class society. If there are classes, for a moment, they're constantly going out of existence because of the endless abundance of opportunity to leave behind. That's American ideology. We hear it all the time. It's the land of opportunity. The American dream is not to be a wage laborer. That is not the American dream. The American dream now has been updated, have good consumer goods, have a house, and so on and so on. What these speeches are really about, overwhelmingly, don't mention any of that. We're about class conflict. Do you know that in the film, you see it's too bad you watch, in the film, there is no, and they talk about his Canton anti-war speech, which lands him in jail. In that speech, he talks about and greets his Bolshevik comrades. The film, there's no mention of that. None. Because they don't want to see it needs to be sanitized, sterilized with that kind of thing. But the world, at least I'm arguing, that he came of age in. He came of age out of a world which was invested in those values, and he broke with it. He was at one point just a conventional railroad craft unionist. He was later an advocate of cooperatives and joined a kind of colonizing cooperative experiment. But when he becomes a socialist, he makes a break with that. Sure, he's of course for democracy and equality, but he realizes, Socialist Party realizes that democracy and equality, without addressing the class, the deep structure of power rooted in the class hierarchy of American society, can't ever work. And that Bolshevism has broken through to the other side. Nobody today wants to see a film on PBS in which some guy who they're treating as a saintly figure, because it would take a lot of explaining that he's welcoming this revolution, as this whole outlaw world did. So that's my take. Watch the film if you want. It's kind of, I'll be honest with you, it's a little boring. Actually.
Take your shots and watch it.
No, he's too saintly, and he's a remarkable man, no question. But that's what how we do. Okay, let's move on. Let me ask you this. Say again.
What's the documentary?
It's just called, oh, shoot. If you just Google Deb's PBS documentary, you'll get it. I can't remember.
We'll send the link around.
Say
to
that.
everyone. We can send a link to it.
Yeah,
around to everyone.
yeah. Yeah.
I was just gonna say there is also, if people want to YouTube, go to the YouTube, there is Bernie Sanders, and I think it was the 80s, did for a little while educational videos, and he made like a half-hour video about Debs, which has a chunk of him like reading a part of the Canton speech, like as Debs. It's a lot of fun. Definitely not Debs's accent, what that would have been, what Indiana accent would have been, but it's a lot of
I
fun.
think there's another point I want to make. Mainstream culture, like at a certain point, at a certain distance from when things are too dangerous to do this, to make radicals who've been embraced and made to seem kosher. But radicals have also done that in order to hide. So that one of the most extraordinary things that we'll talk about it next week is that the Communist Party in the mid-30s and 40s talks about American communism as 20th century Americanism. There's a built-in tendency, I think, to move in that direction, to kind of shy away from when you can. There may be strategic or tactical reasons for good ones even for doing that now and then, but it's a deeper thing than that. And this film to me is also there. Okay, what do you think of Emma Goldman's notion that women's suffrage is fetishistic? I thought you were looking at me.
Sure. It's interesting because she's talking about like, don't buy into this new system that we are being told we have to be a part of. So if you want to buy into it, then yeah, you need to vote. But why should we buy into it? Which is terrible.
What do you think?
Well, I mean, now we've really bought into it. To try to tell me that voting is not worth it or that one shouldn't vote.
Right.
But I think in that time period that you just described as like the death of one version of life and the takeover of life by capitalism, it makes sense to like war against that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, two thoughts. One was that I thought was really interesting that she mentions other countries that had provided women suffrage, and she goes, even in these cases, like there's still not equal pay for women, and I'm like, whoa, well that continued to be true. But oh sorry.
No.
The other thing that I think the analysis of voting as the fetishization like completely holds true to all people in the US today, basically, in the sense of, I don't know, I think every time we go to vote, I'm like, oh, like, almost none of us, myself included, like, have ever heard of any except maybe two of the names on this ballot before. So what are we like, I don't know, I think she made a lot of really good points about the ineffectiveness of it as a demonstration of democracy.
Yes, and also almost,
Well, I mean, I think the contrast case though, and what you bring up in your article is that, I mean, anarchism in the US was never a mass movement and voting was mass behavior. And I do think that like Debs running for office and engaging with a new form of, mass behavior.
yes.
I mean, I do think it's a contrast and there was like a political choices made, so I certainly understand the critique.
And I should mention, of course, she got it probably the Socialist Party was enormously successful for electing people. Maybe 1,000 local officials around the country. Various offices. 5 state assemblymen who was famous in New York who were expelled from the state assembly. Very enormously successful doing that. But on the other hand, what Haywood and others are saying, Goldman too, is that voting, this is voting, not women voting, is a weak form of democracy. And that what we're looking at, Haywood says, what do you think about that? Political power can only be based on industrial power. That's the industrial union. Yeah,
Sorry, I was getting.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like, I was thinking of a comparison between these two things, because like, I think it's really easy, I think maybe not even necessarily incorrect, to kind of, take a look at, say comments about like, well, women's suffrage is fine with the system as naive, and maybe in a similar way that I often would view, say, like the IWW's position on collective bargaining and contracts. But in retrospect, it's easy, it's easy to kind of say like, well, that was naive, that didn't, what were you going to do? Just go on strike forever? But people really believed that that's what they would do. And at the time, like, you're looking at, say, who's calling for arbitration, who's calling for bargaining and for contracts, it's the liberals, it's Gumpers, it's the business unions, and these people. And so, comparing those two things, helps me maybe think of, it's not necessarily wrong to say that, those positions were wrong and historically a thing that's borne out, but, to put yourself in that position at the time, it's,
I think
it's
that's
hard
a
to say.
great point. But I think if you were here the first time, I made the point that we have to always be careful to remember that the past is a foreign country where people do things differently there, and respect for the context that people were in. It may look so obvious to us. No, we will be looked at exactly that way. I guarantee you, by historians some years from now. No, it's the context and perspective, and right, it's the role that, for instance, a Samuel Gompers is playing at that time. His cozying up to big industrialists, his cozying up to the government during its most repressive moments, its failure to come to the aid, in most, not all cases, of battle strikers. Yes.
Well, I mean, I guess I have a question, which is just how we, or maybe I should say, I'll send a question to make up. The question is like, I guess I want to know is like how representative Goldman's position is. Is it an anarchist thing, or is this like a more generally held position? Because it's just hard for me to, it's like she makes some great points, but just it's kind of hard to gauge without knowing some very specific things. And I don't know about the suffrage movement. I mean, because I feel like my comment would be just it feels like it comes out of such a just like an analysis of the history that we're talking about. This kind of rivalry that you see in the text between like these reformist positions that are trying to like take the edge off of class conflict, and people who are really trying to accentuate the class conflict. It's like the great points she makes are like, well, look at these women politicians who come into office with the idea that women are going to purify politics and then, outlaw saloons, and that's where the working men in Wyoming are like actually organized. It's like a very concrete like class analysis of what the suffrage movement represents. And I actually don't know enough about the suffrage movement to know like if that's an accurate analysis of what it represented was like essentially
I think
small
it's a
groups
pretty accurate
of
analysis. It's a middle class party, middle class movement. It does not engage in great numbers working class women, and it doesn't mainly address. There are elements. There's something called the Women's Trade Union League, does do that. There are other elements of the suffrage movement or women's movements that are allied with suffrage that do that. But in the main, it doesn't. It's a very tough question to answer about Goldman's influence. The anarchist movement, as Jeremy pointed out, is a small movement. And it has a lot of publications, it makes a lot of noise, and it commits acts of terror all around the world. And she defends those acts of terror. And that's for us a symptom and an indication of the kind of liberal nature of the moment that can justify a lot of stuff. And she's enormously popular. If she speaks someplace, it's like Bernie. I mean, relative. I mean, people come out and hear her. And she's a martyr. She goes to jail all the time, just for exercising her right of free speech. She's enormously popular. So what is her influence? The movement is small. anarchism is really limited. What she herself has listened to, read. So I don't know how to.
Do you think the suffrage movement was playing this role that she's talking about they're taking the end, like drawing people away from,
I don't think they were doing that consciously, but effectively. I think the suffrage movement is largely oriented that way. Largely, it's part of that. When I was talking before, this failure. Some of these are very well-positioned women who are at the head of the suffrage movement in the progressive era, and have a lot of sympathy for, say, garment workers. They show up on garment workers' picket lines and so on. But it's part of this process of a middle-class, upper bourgeois world failing to culturally reproduce itself and finding it has to seek out new ways. And the notion that, look, this is a much more recent notion that women by their nature will exercise, if given the vote, a more pacifying, egalitarian, that's the word I'm looking for, influence on society is a widely held view, not by her, obviously. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and also just looking at it, like at the very end, I mean, I guess a lot of it's obviously focused on like suffrage and voting and whether or not it can like solve the kind of political, social questions at the time or like advance them. But at the end, she just kind of like takes like, I think a clearly, it's kind of focused on like women's liberation, what will bring like women freedom. And she says like, her development, her freedom, her independence must come from and through herself. That is by trying to learn the meaning and substance of life and all its complexities, by freeing herself from the fear of public opinion and public condemnation. Only that and not the ballot will set women free. So I think there's also like a point being made about just like what freedom for women looks like.
Yes, and
it's really beautiful.
Goldman will oscillate back and forth between statements like that, which are highly individual in their focus, and statements which are much more collective. She's and saying the only real way women and people generally will find their individual freedom is in their association with others, but that association has to be free, not coerced by the government. That's why she will eventually become anti-Soviet, why she's anti-socialist for that matter, the Socialist Party, because she thinks the government is inimical to that kind of freedom. It has to be this free association, but she acknowledges that that process you just read about can't happen in isolation. It has to happen in social relations with the working class. Because in the end, what she says is, without ending economic exploitation, none of this is going to change. Let me move on to something else about Deb's. He makes a remark in one of the things you read that the two parties are identical. Remember this? So what do you think about that, given what we've talked about? The capitalist parties, and there's no difference between them. That's the socialist position then.
I think it's true to this day.
Well, I don't know in that time period. Honestly, I wanted to ask you that. I don't, because I think they become more differentiated basically in the New Deal, right?
Forget about the New Deal. What did we just
No, I
say?
know this, but I just don't. I had a question about that very line because I feel sometimes people overstate the similarity. Socialists tend to not acknowledge today, not be able to address people's arguments about the differentiation.
Deb's doing that then.
And well, so I'm just wondering whether.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I definitely was thinking about like the context. I mean, what you were describing, for instance, is that like the Democrats and Republicans at the time did have actually quite a lot of like overlap in policies. They also had like, these contesting wings or each trying to do sort of the same thing with each of the parties. They didn't have like very stable social bases. They were heavily like, my sense is they didn't have like, any sort of like mass sort of like internal decision making or election of leadership, but they were like sort of what in Europe you would call at the time like parties of notables, like kind of the upper echelons just kind of chose who was at the head of those. So they were like, on the one hand, you can, I think, arguably say there's elements of truth about that to the present. They're both bourgeois capitalist parties, but also like what a bourgeois capitalist party was in 1916 is a little different than what a bourgeois capitalist party is.
Sure. And what I would argue is that he's ignoring the evidence right in front of his face, that these parties do have deep divisions. There's some are elements of them, like say the Taft wing or the Wall Street wing of the Democratic Party, have no intention of reforming anything. The Roosevelt wing, the Bull Moose wing, the Woodrow Wilson wing do want to reform things. Not, they're not socialists by a long margin, but I think there's always a kind of, I think the left, it doesn't mean you align, there's nothing strategic that necessarily follows from recognizing that capitalism in crisis produces political differences within its own ranks. It happens all the time. It's a fractious way of living. They're always, and to think of capitalism as always having a unitary, coherent, hegemonic one line is not historically accurate and couldn't be, because it's too much a system in flux. It's always changing. It's always facing, not always, but facing periodic crises. And he's kind of ignoring that. That is socialist orthodoxy at that time, and in some ways it may still be that. And like I say, I'm not imputing or suggesting that therefore there's a strategic consequence that follows. Oh, you work in the Democratic Party today. I'm not arguing that. In fact, I have mixed feelings about it. But I am arguing that in his essay, he's blind to that. He's not acknowledging what's going on. Other comments on that? Oh, yeah, sorry, yes.
Yeah, I think the real scary thing to think about in this time period, and maybe to think of some different ways in ours, is that I think all of these people had this great fear about not really knowing how each of these individual factions in the parties work. Like if you take mid-century American two-party politics, you had the four factions, right? You had the liberal Republicans and their sort of conservative backers versus the Southern Democrats and then the FDR populist Democrats. You had these four factions governing the parties at any given time. And because these four factions existed, you could largely guarantee that nothing big was going to happen or no serious change would happen, and certainly none happened until the 1960s. So when you give a speech like that, when you make a statement like that, it seems very easy to tell an audience that maybe hasn't sussed out those even more complicated party politics. Yeah, they essentially are the same, because what else are you going to tell disaffected masses? You're going to tell them to vote for somebody and it turns out your faction ends up losing? Right. That's terrifying.
Right. So, yes, so it's a politically dead end. Yeah. That's what you said.
Yeah, essentially, or at least the risk of it being a dead end is high enough that.
Yeah, I'm wondering what he's extremely concerned clearly with, especially it seems like Teddy Roosevelt and the progressives undercutting the socialists.
Yes.
And so I guess what I'm wondering is to what extent, and I have no idea, I'm wondering, to what extent is he using a rhetorical tactic basically to try to continuously highlight the divide, or does he truly think that the progressives and Teddy Roosevelt are fully disingenuous?
To that exact point, I also imagine in that context, with the Bolshevik Revolution happening, it seems much more realistic and important that a socialist be president. And it seems like, well, in 10 years, the socialists will be running things. So forget these political parties. And it's in a way that seems much more distant and abstract, I think, in our time, right?
Yeah. Yes, Jeremy.
I was just going to say, another thing that's maybe part of his thinking about it is, as far as I understand, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Rooseveltian progressivism has really nothing to do with the labor movement. It's entirely almost a middle class phenomenon. So he, in part, when he's talking about the parties, he's also talking about their class bases, and he's saying the class base of the kind of politics we're trying to build is substantially different from the class base of the existing
yes,
parties.
I think that's true. They do make gestures in the direction of the labor question. child labor, an 8-hour day. But their world is more of middle class reform. It has no real connections to even the organized trade people, much less the broad. That's absolutely right, and that could be what he's thinking. Let me change the subject one more time. Deb says minorities make history. What do you think about that? Here we are with Democrats. Minorities make history. And of course, he was hardly the first to say it. It may be true. How do we reconcile that with a belonging to a movement that values democracy so highly? You know, you asked, but what is Emma Goldman's? I don't know the question, but it's a more general question. Again and again and again, we will see this reveal, and even the nights of, we are talking about minorities that incite, organize, strategize movements that then become bigger and more massive. But their role, they are minorities. The civil rights movement initially is and recurrently was that. When we look at, just go ahead for a moment, the Flint sit-down strike, the great sit-down strike, 36 and 7 at General Motors, is very carefully orchestrated by a handful of people who have won the loyalty and commitment of many more people. It's a kind of molecular relationship between a leadership, very left-wing, often communist or socialist, and a larger, less committed and active mass. So it's an interesting question for a democratic movement to weigh the role of the minority. At what point Bolshevism is the scary, right? The scary specter at the end of that minority tale. But we would be just wrong to deny the role of minority. Debs is right. What do you think?
I was actually just reading Daniel Guérin, the French anarchist Marxist, kind of has his one foot in each world. And he was writing about this seeming contradiction. He was recalling sort of like historical anarchists, Kropotkin and Weber. And they all mentioned something that's kind of like counterintuitive, that most of these anarchists actually were kind of vanguardists in their own way.
Yes, absolutely.
Like they absolutely thought their role was to agitate, like a minority, to agitate and educate people. But they would stress that it was to agitate people to self-rule. And that the distinction that they would draw between themselves and Leninists would be that they would use the Leninists of a different kind of vanguardism.
In a way, the anarchists commit the most extreme form of vanguardism. They believe, the anarchist movement is very complicated, a lot of different factions. But Emma believed, and others, lover and partner at that time, Alexander Burton, in the propaganda of the Dean, that these acts of terror, and they're all over the world, all over Europe, here, you know, crown princes being bumped off all over the place, in Italy and Spain and Portugal and so on. I mean, this is serious. That will inspire, that nothing else. That is the key to inspiring mass uprising, insurrection, acts by tiny minorities, and that then will follow the mass upheaval. And just pause for a second. There is latent in that a kind of desperateness, and it speaks in a way to Goldman's very interesting, I think it's in my essay, about the people and the kind of disappointment Remember that? I can, yeah, what about that? And then I include that. Because when we're dealing with the savagery of capitalism, capitalism would not be savage if it didn't despoil people, if it didn't make people do terrible things. It wouldn't be what we hated. When Jack London, that quote, I didn't remember. Jack London says in The Iron Heel, they live like beasts in great squalid ghettos, festering in misery and degradation. Then there's Berkman's quote about what happens with the people that are asleep. What's wrong? It's kind of a tragic circumference of the movement as it's building, winning, and yet finding its limitations, which are heartbreaking. You see what I mean?
Can I answer?
No, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, your previous question.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting one about like, if you're thinking about the labor question, like how do you activate, it's millions of people, right? But how do you activate it? I mean, it always starts somewhere, right? Like most unions don't start with tens of thousands or millions of people.
Right.
But I feel like in the American labor movement, that's true in many ways. Like I know this is jumping a gun to a later year, but 1934 is often held up as like maybe the biggest year for the American labor movement. And there were 3 general strikes. And in each of those general strikes, there's a small left-wing socialist or communist organization that plays like a real key role in organizing it. And not that it's like it takes on a life of its own, but that there's a group of committed radicals in each of those places, which was San Francisco, Minneapolis, and Toledo, I think. And my union, which is the UFT, like we often refer to the history where the first strike was 5% of the membership at the time, which at the time was sort of seen as like abysmal and kind of a defeat, but in retrospect, it was actually extremely important because that laid the groundwork for future strikes. But I think it is an interesting dynamic, especially if you're in a political organization that's sort of inherently minoritarian. How do you go about activating?
Right. This goes back to the question I raised at the very beginning of the course that I've always puzzled over, the mystery of why people don't revolt and why they ever do revolt. Because both to revolt is very, very dangerous. Not revolt, however, is to accept this kind of humiliation, savage, festering, misery, degradation.
Yeah.
So,
and maybe your early points get at this also, but like sort of the time period we're talking about, these massive labor uprisings where the National Guard is called and people are killed. There's no like by and large, there's no regulatory environment. So there's no pressure valve where people in the unions or outside of them can point to them and say like, well, this should be handled at the National Labor Relations Board, right? So it seems much easier to have these huge, massive conflagrations at the time. Pre-FDR, there's no environment built to take
well, it's a very thin
pressure
one.
off.
That's what the National Civic Federation, there is arbitration, they're trying to erect, but they have no traction and they're not serious about really according real robust rights to the working. Yes.
I just want to add to that. I was listening to some podcasts. I wish I could remember the specifics, but they were going on about how World War I really inaugurated a new role for the state, really invented the modern state in the production of the wartime economy and just all the various aspects. So it's made me think that, why we have this periodization of this very violent period of the turn of the century, of the 19th century. Then you go to the 20th century, it's a different story. And I think maybe, maybe Emma was right. Maybe she was correct, perhaps, in her anti-statism, that the growth of this kind of liberal state, or where God bless the FDR state, we wish we had that back, but even still, I think we can't put that.
Yeah, I think that's what we're gonna pick up next week. That's 2 weeks from now. That's exactly the dilemma. And we put it well. We wish we had it back. Do we?
Well, I don't
Well, just the second thing you're saying about Goldman's disappointment with people. I mean, I guess it's just a theme in the whole reading for me is it's like the starkness with which they see that they frame the class struggle.
Yeah.
And that anything outside of the kind of full enchilada that whole is nothing. I mean, it really runs through the Goldman on suffrage and Debs on race that and I just wonder about that because it's like they can't even. I think the system clearly had more to offer the average person than they thought. Like they really viewed this. Like I think that Debs is pretty explicit. That speech is like socialism is inevitable. Capitalism is moving towards it, and in different ways, they all seem like they can't relate to reformist struggles at all within this framework, and that.
Yes and no. They do engage with the IWW does, and Emma Goldman and her people do, all kinds of fights to preserve, for example, the right to free speech. This is a major activity that all of these movements are engaged in because without it, they have no platform, they can't proselytize. So they do that. That's a basic First Amendment right, and they believe in it and they fight for it. But I take your point. Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say to go back. I mean, I think that's right, and I do think, I think for some of the reasons we're saying, it was like potentially, it seemed like a revolutionary period. Like it seemed like the old world was definitely sort of collapsing, and in fact, that was true. Like the old world did collapse in Europe. It's just what emerged. I mean, so on the one hand, I'm sympathetic, Steve, with what you said about like. Maybe she was writing her anti-statism, but it's also true that like the revolutions did not occur. Like no advanced capitalist country had a revolution, had a successful revolution.
Not only did Bolsheviks succeed in a way that they warmly embrace all of them, but then all of Europe is aflame. There's Soviets established, there's even a Soviet Portland, but could carried away. But there are Soviets in Bavaria, there's Soviet in Hungary, actual Soviet government is established in Hungary. I mean, indigenous, it's not so, most people are exporting people don't do. So we have to try to get our heads into the excitement, the thrill of that moment, the road to Petrograd, what they're all dreaming of, and it happened. And these are serious, intelligent people, and they're not crystal ball gazers. And they saw something they had dreamed of their whole lives. And stop.
Sure.
I gotta.
So just announcement in 2 weeks. Wait, do you want to remind us what?
Yes. In 2 weeks, we're going to talk about the New Deal, which is an attempt to, which is the culmination and maybe the resolution of the labor question for quite a long time. And we're going to read an essay by me again about the New Deal. We're going to read an article by a scholar about Black women in the Communist Party. We're going to read do you know who William Z. Foster was? Foster was at one time a syndicalist. He was one of the key leaders of the 1919 steel strike, which is part of that glorious 1919 year, but then becomes part of the new Communist Party and eventually becomes the chairman of the Communist Party. And in the early 30s, writes a proposal about forming a labor party. So we're going to read that document. And try to come up with some quotes, and that's what we're going to do.
So come back in 2 weeks. Otherwise, if you aren't a DSA member, please join. DSAUSA.org/join. The other thing is we usually, does anyone have a hat? We usually pass the hat at these events.
We do have a hat.
Beautiful, because this office space costs money. It costs to keep a roof over our head and to support the work we do. So please, if you can, give a few bucks. If you don't have any cash, if you wanna come to me and Venmo me and I'll pass it on to our treasurer. And finally, check out, we have a calendar on our website, socialists.nyc. Check out upcoming events, organizing. It's summer, so there's lots of like social events going on, hangouts in parks, picnics, etc. And the occasional picket. Obviously, there's a strike going on, and at WGA, SAG-AFTRA, and more. So yeah, get involved, and we'll see everybody in a couple weeks.
Yeah, let me just say, I thank you all. I thought this was a great, to me anyway, great discussion. I appreciate your comments and thoughtfulness, yeah.
Right, I got you.
Who are this?
Yes.